Please join me in welcoming on our show today poet, diplomat Abhay K. Abhay, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Goran.
At the onset, congratulations on the release of your new collection of poems, The Seduction of Delhi. You know, we can understand the habitation of Delhi, the conquering of Delhi, the experiencing of Delhi. The seduction of Delhi, why did you choose this word in particular?
Seduction of Delhi is Delhi's power to attract emperors, traders, marauders since centuries. Delhi has been one of the most inhabited cities since past 2000 years and even more than that. And probably I tried to find an answer. What is that seduction of Delhi that keeps it alive, that keeps getting interesting people getting to Delhi?
And what did you find was the allure of this seducing city?
I think it's Delhi's ability to reinvent itself. If you look at the past 7 cities of Delhi, they're all different from each other, but there's also a common thread that weaves them all together. And I found that Delhi's seduction is not one, but many.
So let's take you back to your first visit to Delhi. What was your experience?
I came to Delhi in 1997 as a student at the Delhi University at the Kirimal College, and my first visit was to the campus, to the Kirimal College campus. It was a Saturday. I vividly remember that day, and the college was shut. So I came back, but I found a sense of sort of, a vast green city which I had not come across, and I think that made me fall in love with Delhi instantly. I mean, perfect for poetry.
Lovely. That means you're saying this beautiful city has everything to offer. You can choose to take the noise, the pollution, the people, the distance, the warmth, nature, history. The choice is the viewing eye, and that's what makes the difference.
Then I moved from Delhi University to Jawaharlal Nehru University.
Another lovely campus.
And another lovely campus.
True.
So campus to campus, it was north and then it was south. And sometimes I used to travel from north to south. And I would, and that time being unconscious that, I'm crossing millennia of history and heritage. It only came to me later when I returned from Moscow after my first assignment, 5 years, spending 5 years in Russia. Then I realized that Delhi, the distances I was crossing from north to south, from Delhi University to JNU or JNU to Delhi University, it contained the 7 cities of Delhi. It was, I was crossing from Lal Kot, where the Qutub Minar is today, through Siri and Firoz Shah Kotla. I mean, all of these, Lal Killa, so all these cities were lined up in terms of, their sequences.
Right.
And when I finally joined, when I became a diplomat, and I started staying in KZ Marg, just very close from this place, so I moved to exactly what is called New Delhi, not very far away from the Purana Killa where Indraprastha was supposed to be.
Right.
So it at an instant it occurred to me that what a beautiful city I am in. So many layers of history and heritage in the path, lying scattered in the path.
Right. So there is this beauty of the city on the physical level, which is you see a beautiful city. But getting into the spirit, the soul, and the history of the city, how did that journey start for you?
It started with, for example, I made friends from different parts of India, and these friends, they moved from one university to another university, and slowly, I got, I started appreciating different monuments of, the city contains, and places like National Gallery of Modern Art, National Museum, and so on. And so sort of attachment grew with not only with people and buildings and places, but also with food. You know, one would go to Delhi Hut and you know, savor which was, I mean, food from all across India. So then, you know, the age I was in, also you know, the college time and university time. So also, you know, you
spread your wings at that time.
You spread your wings, and you
Yes.
you get to, you know, you fall in love, and you know, sort of. So the place becomes you know, inseparable from your memory, and it becomes part of you.
There are many of us who have lived in the city, many born, brought up, and somewhere while being in the city, we still don't see the city. And here you have people who come to visit the city or study or live in it for some time, and they manage to see the city. What stops people living in the city from really seeing it?
This is, Garan, this is also a metaphor for life. You know, many of us live, but we don't see.
True.
And as an outsider, you have an advantage, and that advantage is curiosity. Because if you, it says in you call no ghar ki murgi daan barabar. So I mean, when you are close to things, you take it for granted. If you've grown up in Karol Bagh, or if you've grown up in, you know, Pandara Road, so things don't come up to you naturally. But if you are an outsider, as most of us are in Delhi, you tend to question. Okay, so this is Lal Killa. What is its history? This is Parathe Wali Gali in Chandni Chowk.
Right.
So what used to be there? You know. So it's also a curious mind, and then if you have the poetic sensibility, so you look it from a poetic angle, that what it would have been like to be in Lal Killa when Shah Jahan was here.
Right.
So I think as an outsider, you have this benefit.
Now that you've peeled the layers of the city, does it help you understand the city better and why the city is or behaving in a particular manner?
You see city from, you know, a sort of eternal perspective. You know, you see it from its rise and fall, and particularly Delhi, which has had so many rises and so many falls, so many plunders and so many constructions. And what you realize is that, you know, a sense of hope and continuity, that even if you know, something goes wrong today, which hopefully will not,
right,
then another city would
survival. I think city is a city of survivors also.
Yes.
Right.
So another place would come up nearby. People would not leave this place. They would not go as far away. They might be persuaded to go to Daulatabad by some Muhammad bin Tughlaq.
Okay.
But the people of Delhi, you know, they will return to Delhi.
Right. A poet's lens. I think poetry has this beauty of seeing romance and beauty in things which normally look mundane. When did you understand that maybe you had a poet's eye?
I realized it when I saw a flower girl selling flowers, as they do even now at the traffic stop. And I saw, you know, I was wondering that, you know, from where does she get all these beautiful flowers? And a poem started, you know, taking birth. And I found that you know, they pick it from the graves, they pick it from, you know, some places, and her journey, you know, came up. I mean, all the poems in this book are persona poems, in the sense the people speak themselves. You know, monuments speak themselves.
Okay.
So the flower girl started speaking, and you know, a beautiful poem came out of it. And I realized that, you know, I think I should be able to bring out the voice of the voiceless, monuments and security guards and the rag pickers, and those maids, for example, those who don't speak.
So do you think that somewhere a city with its hustle, bustle and people and momentum of life can be unkind to history?
I think they are not consciously unkind to history, maybe unconsciously, because obviously you and I have to get done with our daily chores, and we obviously we don't have the luxury to sort of relish history at the expense of present.
Right.
But all I am trying to do is to say, or is to express that we can live our present better if we have a little corner for history. We can preserve our city better. We can see our city in a different light. So you see, the past will affect our choice of action. So if I am trying to litter my city, and if I have this great sense of history that what a wonderful city I live in, and that's going to impact my decision to litter the city. So I may choose not to drop a bag of polythene, or choose to behave myself better,
Right.
choose to respect women. There's a poem in this book called Delhi as I Am, and it talks about that my streets are named after Satya, Nyaya, and there are streets in Delhi, in Chanakyapuri, where a street is called Satya,
Niti and everything.
Nyaya, and Shanti Path.
True.
So and yet women perpetually seek justice in one of the courts. So it also brings out that what are the ideals. I talk about Dara Shikoh. I don't find a street named after Dara Shikoh, but there is a street named after Aurangzeb. Dara Shikoh was a scholar. He was a Sufi.
Right.
He was the licit heritor or legal inheritor, heir of Shah Jahan, but he was killed by his own brother treacherously, and he's a great person to be remembered, but I could not find a street named after him. And there is a poem on Dara Shikoh that nobody cares.
Okay.
Dara Shikoh.
So this is beautiful and interesting, because how history is written, how history treats its people, and what are the values that history values to record for posterity. There can be huge shifts, and there's so much subjectivity in that.
Yes. It also stands for, it's also a mirror for us, that what we really care for is softness, or is soft,
anything which is
soft
gentle.
Side, gentle side of gentle side of our nature is should be subdued by the cruel side of our nature. Is humane greater, or our animal nature is greater? So these are some of the eternal questions which I asked through my poems. There is a poem about Ghalib, who had to travel for more than 6 months to go to Calcutta and petition Lord Amherst to double his pension of merely rupees 62, and it was not granted. He came back to Delhi, and none of his sons survived. His brother died in arms, and then came the massacre of Delhi, and he was left to bring down the corpses from the lampposts, hanging from the lamppost and trees, and to lament his destiny. And that happened to the one of the greatest poets of Delhi.
Right.
I talk about Neem and Yamuna and Jamun. Neem and Jamuna, you can see everywhere in Delhi.
True.
And Neem it's a poem which talks about that through my bitter sweet fruits, people would know when it is ripe and when it is not ripe. Wise people know that when it is ripe to eat and not so ripe to eat.
You spoke of sensitivity, and I think the sensitivity of how history also records sensitivity. As a poet, you're hugely sensitive. Do you feel sensitivity is a value, and as a way to be, is a difficult one to carry on because you're straddling both worlds? You know, you're straddling the real world and also this world where you think and you dream and you see beyond the obvious. And when you see beyond the obvious, there are so many things that come up. How the world will receive them, how kind or unkind, or forgiving or not forgiving. So how important is all that, and do you think the world values it?
One of my findings have been the similarity between poetry and diplomacy. As you said, the real world and the world of imagination. And I found that there are 4 similarities between poetry and diplomacy.
Okay.
And these are, the first is ambiguity. Second is brevity.
Okay.
Third is one of the is this sensitivity, because both a poet and a diplomat has to be very sensitive. Until you are sensitive, you won't be able to get to know the concerns of others. Right. It's always putting one's own feet in others' shoes, right, and seeing the world from that perspective.
Right.
So, as a poet, I get into the skin of a flower girl, or a rag picker, and or Yamuna river, and I try to see the world from their perspective.
Right. And of course, beyond empathy is also this wonderful capacity to listen. So as a diplomat, yes, you need to listen, and as a poet, you need to listen to the city. You need to listen to the trees.
Yes, I mean, I learned that the highest poetry is where the poetry is the expression of the voice of the voiceless. Those things which can't speak for themselves. Those who speak can speak for themselves, but those who don't, I think a poet has to.
And that's like a responsibility also.
Yes.
Right.
So
you said there were 4 similarities. What's the 4th?
The last one is finesse.
Okay.
Both a diplomat and a poet have to be very, I mean, it's a very fine art. I think poetry is the highest art in literature.
Right. Knowing how much to say, when to leave it, when to let it go.
Yes.
Right.
In poetry too, silences matter a lot than words. So it's not exactly what you say; it's also what you don't say.
True.
So and there's a lot of space and silence between one stanza and another stanza, one line and another line. In the same way, in diplomacy, you think twice before saying nothing.
That's so beautiful, and I think that's the beauty of every communication, to say, you can hear my words, but can you read my silence? Abhay, so when you decided to move into diplomacy and poetry moved along with you, you never thought of becoming a full-time poet?
Poetry is a state of being, so you are always a poet. It's not, poets are not those who write poetry. Poets are persons who have these poetic sensibilities.
Lovely.
So it's a way of seeing the world.
So it's like a lens.
It cannot be a profession.
It's like a lens.
It's like a lens.
So you never thought you're going to make it your bread and butter?
No, you can't. I mean, until you are a Darbari Kavi, poetry is a spiritual thing. It can't be even a thing, So it's not about.
It's who you are.
Yes, it's who you are.
Yes.
I mean, you can hide it for all the time. Earlier, I mean, one of the Nobel laureates, Wisława Szymborska, she said that poets are ashamed to call themselves poets. So many of the poets, but they are poets, and they don't want to say that. And Pablo Neruda says that earlier priests used to hide. I mean, themselves. I mean, poets used to hide themselves as priests. Their goal used to be, recite, and they used to take that profession to, hide that they are not poets.
What should make everybody come out and say, I write, this is my poetry, and I love to express myself like that?
Because all art is individual. The whole idea of art is to return you your individuality. And what we value most is the individual expressions. You would like a M.F. Hussain painting, or a Raza painting, or a Gaitonde's painting, because they are very individual expressions. They do not match with each other, because matching makes it communal. It makes it a social and group thing.
Right.
And the whole idea of art is to return your individuality. So every poem of every poet has to be different. I mean, it has to be individual's expression. It's not somebody a group's expression. So that's why I would encourage whoever writes poetry to write one's own stuff. Never even if you copy a Mona Lisa, it would be a second grade thing. It might Mona Lisa might be a great work of art, but copying is not. So it's your own thing, whether it is whatever it is, that really matters.
So this bit about creativity, to be different, your individuality, diversity. So these are things which make us stand apart, stand out, also be ourselves. Yet there is a unifying factor that we all appreciate diversity.
Yes.
But why are most of us so scared of differences? And that's why this whole concept of community, commune, which does not nurture diversity, where everybody wants to be similar. You see how we refer to people from universities. So and so is a product of such and such university.
Right.
It's a very industrial revolution kind of
batches
terminology. Batches, batch of this. That means we want to produce these little robots. We say
yes.
tuck, 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 tuck.
Yes, robots.
Right,
yes,
right.
That thinking is, you see, it's that kind of thinking is beneficial for groups or larger groups.
But it's divisive intrinsically.
It's it's wherever what is politics. Politics is where more than one individual come together to have some kind of an agreement, some kind of social contract, what Rousseau calls.
Right.
And then we give up a bit of our individual freedom to opt for a greater good.
Right.
So the idea of art is to return one's individuality, even in that order. So we have social groups, we have batches, and I'm from this batch,
yes.
and I'm alumni of so and so.
Right.
Because human beings also have this intrinsic need to belong to something. So, but how do you shape that belonging? That's the question. Today, we also belong to the whole planet as much as we belong to our countries, our states, our districts, our villages. So it depends at what level of consciousness we are, and accordingly we shape our belongingness. But art, what it does, that it keeps a balance. An individual can belong to certain institution or society, but still can be an individual.
Right, right.
Its unique voice. Either it could be a painting, it could be a poem, it could be a song.
So when you started expressing your individuality through poetry, and you find subjects you choose, and whatever the heart flows, as you said, it's
yes.
a way to be.
Yes.
So when you decide, I'm looking for a theme, I'm going to club, because publishing a book is also somewhere you're bringing into a structured form that which is unstructured in the head.
Yes.
So how do you manage the ramblings of a poet's mind into the confines of a book?
What happens that obviously you don't set out that I'm going to write a book on Delhi. It can happen in prose, but it does not happen in poetry.
Okay.
So you go one by one. So you have an experience of a place and you write about it, and slowly and gradually over 2 years, 3 years, you have enough number of poems, or you can call them meditations, and when they gather, then you try to see that. So this was ready in 2012. Then I met an Italian artist, Tarshito, and he shared my passion for Delhi, and we collaborated. He, inspired by poems, he did paintings, and what we ultimately ended up doing was what we call poetry paintings on Delhi. So it was poetry painting pairing. We ended up having this beautiful book, which has paintings on Delhi and poems on Delhi. These things are not planned.
So your poetry style, from when you started just penning down the musings of a poetic mind,
Yes.
to when you actually became serious enough about it to say, I'm going to publish them.
Yes.
Have you changed as a poet?
I started, my first poem was, it's called the Song of the Soul, and it's a very short poem, I'll say. I was always here, as the blowing wind or the falling leaves, as the shining sun or the flowing streams, as the chirping birds or blooming buds, as the blue sky or the empty space. I was never born, I didn't die. It's sort of a spiritual poem.
Absolutely.
And then lots of love poems happened afterwards in Moscow. My first collection was called Enigmatic Love, poems from the fairy tale city of Moscow. And you evolve, you start evolving. I think evolve is the right word.
Okay.
And then I found historical personalities like Dostoevsky, Gogol, Pushkin. I mean, all those Russian writers, I wrote about them as persona poems. I wrote a lot about struggle of humanity. I mean, in terms of struggle for power, struggle for beauty. So all these and the inherent contradictions of life. I wrote about immortality and life and death. And there are so many of us who are continuously engaging with death and the thoughts of death and what would happen after death. So all these issues, I would say, all these concerns.
And they're deeply philosophical.
Yes.
Yes. Love and romance.
Yes.
We normally limit it to an individual, we limit it to a shape, we limit it to a color, we limit it to an emotion.
Yes.
For a poet who has so deeply loved cities, people, places, virtues, values, nature, what really is love and romance?
I have a poem called I Would Not Speak of Love that runs into my veins. Rather, I would cherish in silence fruits of love.
Oh, how beautiful.
So it's the whole universe is filled with love. I mean, look at the love in the death of a star. Without that, we won't be here today.
Right.
Look at the love. So it's pervasive. It's all around us. You ask anybody that what's the ultimate. Why are you here? Why are you working so hard every day? One answer would be that I care for this and this person, so I have to carry on.
Okay.
So some people say that love is what runs the world. Then there is other side of love, and it is in these four beautiful silence. Violent silence. Silent violence. Beautiful violence. It could turn from beautiful silence to beautiful violence. I mean.
And all that is love.
And all that is love. It's different. You call roop. Different faces of love. I mean, all of us go through that, when you go out, and you have a fight, and you have this silence which, nobody's speaking, and there's a great,
you can cut the silence actually with a knife. It's so thick.
It's so thick, that silence, and that's like a violent silence.
Yeah.
But ultimately, beautiful violence, It's also it's that sort of violence which comes with a rose,
Okay. Okay. That's dark. Okay. When you see emotion, when you see love, when you see caring, these are universal values.
Yes.
Yet poets have individual sensibilities. Are there something which are called cultural sensibilities or national sensibilities? Because why is an Indian poet different from a Latin poet, from an American poet? Or are they similar?
Indian poets have different concerns.
Okay.
I have heard European poets. They have largely, a sense of melancholy in their voice. If you look at their poems, they have moved far away from rhymes and meters, and it's more of a
free verse they're writing in.
Free verse. Walt Whitman was writing free verse
many years ago.
Many years ago.
Yes.
But it's not only free verse, but it's also the melancholy, the sense of loneliness, a voice where a frigid voice, a landscape where you have miles of glaciers. That kind of imagery, that comes from.
So cold and grey and
yes,
dark.
Yes. If you look at the Latin American poetry, I've been editing now an anthology called Capitals, which would contain 196 poems on 196 capital cities of the world.
Okay.
And I've crossed 120. So I've had now enough number of poems, read enough number of poems from across the world, from all continents. So I can get a sense that what is there in the African writing and what's there in the East Asian writing. So, so we do get affected by geography. We do get affected by the nature which surrounds us. If you look at a poem from Rajasthan, there is lots of color.
Yes.
And lots of brilliance, lots of light.
As if it's making up for the landscape,
yes,
no?
Yes,
the dull
yes,
landscape.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So when you see these differences and you say that the concerns are different, I think that's beautifully put, because finally poetry, like writing, is about the times and what is around you and your experiences.
Right.
In the Indian context, modern Indian poetry, where do you think it's heading, and what is the current scenario?
Indian contemporary poetry is very vibrant. Contemporary poetry scene is so vibrant, in fact, that many agree that the best writing in Indian English is happening in poetry than in fiction.
Okay.
And this is something to be curious about.
Yeah. Why do you think that's happening?
It's I think because fiction is being written for success. Poetry is not written for success. It is not written for publicity or for fame. Poetry is written because somebody gets those voices, or somebody intrinsically believes in those voices or ideas. So it's not happening. I mean, much of poetry does not get published, but still lots of very important works are happening in I would say about Indian English, because I read.
So poetry is extremely personal.
It's not really. I mean, it could be. See, poetry is like you can make a poem in a minute, but it takes a year also to make a poem. So it depends which kind of poetry we are looking for. I would not really, appreciate too much of personal poetry.
Okay.
Which has too much of me, I, and myself. Lots of poetry is being written today is personal, and it always was. But I would not be too much interested in personal poetry. I would be interested in reading poetry that transcends personal and universalizes that personal experience into universal experience.
Okay.
After all, personal experience is also part of universal experience. For experience of a woman, it could be universal, or it could have a strands of universal experience.
Okay.
And I think that makes great poetry.
So when poetry is written, do you think there's a conscious desire to have a social meaning or a message to it, or it could happen, it could not?
It could happen, it could not. Everything being written from heart is not poetry. It could just be blabbering of words or pain or happiness and everything. But there has to be a certain degree of skills, how to turn a personal, very deeply personal experience into a universal experience.
Okay. So does the craft of poetry turn that into a universal experience, or does the person reading it and his or her sensibility or constraints at that time make it universal for him or her?
It's not either or. It's both ways. So obviously, a poem could be interpreted differently by different people who are reading it, readers.
Right.
At the same time, the person or the poet who has put craft into it, the degree of craft in the poem, in turning into a universal medium, of experience. So obviously, the art is complete when a reader reads it. A poem is only complete when you read it. I have expressed itself, it's in the book, but when you read it, then there is a communication between one individual and another, and poems becomes the bridge.
Okay.
And when the bridge is set, and the poet and the reader are like the two banks of the river,
Okay.
and the bridge is there, then it's a poem, it's set.
So do you feel that poetry as a skill can also be learnt?
Yes, it can be learnt. The expressions are automatic, but the way you shape a poem,
Okay.
that can be learnt. There are like when you say something, there are like post creation interpretations that it has alliteration, but then some of the poets, they themselves have this natural ability to write things or feel things in those ways, in the sense of that all the words begins with the same letter.
Okay.
And once the poem is written, you can discover or decipher those patterns, that this has been written in rhyme, this is written in meter, but I think there's a natural rhythm, and I think gifted poets, they can feel that rhythm of language, not only language but also the rhythm of voice and sounds. And
right. Do you also feel that there is a trend in contemporary Indian poetry towards complexity of language, where sometimes maybe the word is very beautiful, but the sheer complexity can take away from the essence?
It happens. I find dohas of Kabir extremely philosophical and deep, though they are not complex.
Yes, absolutely.
पोथी पढ़ी पढ़ी जगमुआ पंडित भया न कोई, ढाई आखर प्रेम का पढ़े सो पंडित होई. How beautifully said, everything said in 2 lines.
True.
And E is equal to MC square is not too complex. So there is a tendency, which I would agree, and that tendency is in the academic poetry, canonical poetry, where one professor can understand another professor of poetry or literature, where one literary magazine with the very high brows,
Yes.
they can say that this is a very complex poem and we are going to publish it.
Okay.
But idea of poetry is to connect.
Absolutely, you said it.
And I would encourage poets to write not only for other poets, but for everybody. Obviously, it can't be like everybody, 100%. But poets should try to bring the beauty of simplicity.
Right.
Say things without being complex.
Poetry is an expression, Abhay, of what one feels intensely and passionately.
Yes.
Do you feel sometimes you make yourself vulnerable as an individual when you write passionate poetry?
It depends, what kind of passion are we talking about? This book has all passionate poetry, and it has about voiceless people. If I'm writing passionate poetry about passion itself, or which is very personal poetry, where there's lots of talk about relationship, my own relationship, I think to a degree, yes, it would, or I'm writing love poems, which is deeply personal.
Yes.
So, but I would rate these poems as as obviously as the beginning step of poetry, because there is of course everybody writes love poems, and that's there's no harm in that, but that's to begin with. But one has to grow as a poet,
Right.
and ultimately.
So the same emotions which hold different value for you at 10, 15, 20, the same emotion you see differently at the age of 40
Yes.
and 50 and
It's
later
not,
on.
I mean, that chronological.
Okay.
And
But life experiences?
yes, life experiences, and also, I mean, in terms of as your poetic sensibilities grow, you become more subtle, more fine. Your expressions become more pointed, accurate, vivid.
But sometimes what about the innocence of adolescent poetry written simply without the larger understanding and the wisdom, and that can also be so.
That can also be very beautiful. It's as you were saying that lots of passionate poetry is open to are vulnerable, are open to vulnerabilities.
Yes.
So, so I was talking from that angle.
Okay.
Because that can also be vulnerable.
Absolutely.
For example, if you are an adolescent and writing very personal poems, and then your relationship breaks, and then somebody else reads that, so that could be potentially harmful.
And why did I do that?
Yes, yes.
So from this book, would you like to share with our viewers something which you really love?
Yes. So here is a poem I was talking about called Doordarshan.
Okay.
And Neem I also talked about. Yamuna. Let us read Yamuna.
Okay.
Withdrawn and sulky, I flow past Delhi like dark silver, caressing the city shores, draining darkness from Delhi's soul. Rag pickers. Our faces smudged with charcoal, our clothes saggy and torn, our days lost amidst heaps of garbage, searching for nirvana in discarded tin cans. Nearby a stinking slum, our home, waiting to be metamorphosed into a 10-lane highway. Flower girl, which I was talking about, which we meet even today. Bare to the bone in tattered garb, freshness of adolescence on my face, I stand near the traffic, bouquets of roses in my tender hands, red, yellow, pink and white, picked up from the graveyard, waving, begging, hoping someone would buy my flowers. Oh, a cab driver calls me, bargains. I plead, take my flowers. He pulls me nearer. I jerk back with disgust. My clothes torn, flowers scattered. I gather myself, then my flowers, and start again, pleading, hoping. And a poem on Delhi, which is the first poem of this book.
Okay.
My smell, my nakedness, entices hordes of human flesh from far away lands, traders, emperors, marauders. I pose nude up on the hill. Below, a feast of eagles, buzzed, intoxicated. So these are some of the poems from the Seduction of Delhi.
Doordarshan, you didn't read that?
Yes, I'll read Doordarshan.
Right.
I wander the streets of Delhi, seeking my name. Dara the scholar, the Sufi, Shah Jahan's licit heritor. I was trapped and assassinated by my own treacherous brother. I see masters of Delhi have named streets after murderous Aurangzeb, but Doordarshan, the people's prince, no one remembers, no one cares.
Beautiful. So Abhay, there is inherent sadness in all of them. So you're not, there's no depression, there is an acceptance of the reality, but there is sadness. And I think this whole bit about how a poet invariably, because that means his reality, sad.
There is also celebration in number of poems, but also it's the reality which surrounds us. Is the reality of those mute voices who are around us, like a flower girl you saw.
And Darashiko was also mute.
Yes, a rag picker, or Galib, for example, here, or Darashiko. Yamuna, she's flowing without saying a word.
Yes, and you said withdrawn, and
yes.
That's so powerful.
And she's been draining darkness from Delhi's soul.
Very powerful.
So these are, I mean, silent voices around us. Of course, Delhi is a celebration of 7 cities.
All right.
There's a poem on Lodi Garden here.
Yes.
And
yes, some of them are very joyous and happy.
Yes.
Wonderful. So you've given voice to so many voiceless people and places and monuments. Congratulations once again on this beautiful, beautiful book of poems. Wish you all the best, and thank you so much for actually, for this season, giving a voice to our program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Goran. It's been lovely talking with you.
Thank you, Abhay.